Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is go through some terminology and definitions. And so if we get there eventually here, this will be a little awkward. So, so who has a definition of a fuzzy number for me? Is anybody? I know this looks stupid, I'm sorry, but I'm just trying to, so I can still hear you. Fuzzy numbers. Ever heard of them? What about crisp numbers? Nothing? Well, they could be. So a crisp number is just any number that you're thinking of. It could be a real number that has lots of decimals, or it could be an integer. It doesn't matter. But it's a number that's represented with one value. That's a crisp number. What about set theory? Has anybody heard of set theory? So what is set theory or set algebra? Yeah, or set of numbers, right? And so oftentimes you'll represent these with sort of, with, so like this is a set of numbers, right? It's pretty simple. So you got crisp numbers. So that's a crisp number. That's a crisp number. That's a crisp number. And we've got crisp sets, which are just a sequence of numbers. And so fuzzy sets and fuzzy set theory and fuzzy numbers, all these confusing terms. Let's start with a fuzzy number. So a fuzzy number is a number that doesn't necessarily have a precise value, right? It's represented. Sometimes you'll have some sort of range, So if this on the vertical axis is membership, and so 0 is non-membership, and 1 is absolute membership, and then I have some values on a continuous scale. So maybe this is doesn't really matter what this is. It could be from -10 to +10, and the number 1, you know, would be represented like this as a crisp number, and as a fuzzy number, it might be represented like that. You could think of this almost like a distribution, but be careful with that analogy because it's very different than a distribution in a statistical sense. So crisp numbers will just have one value, and then fuzzy numbers, depending on their shape, and we'll get into different shapes, can be represented by something that, at least by analogy, is sort of similar to these distributions that you might be uh, familiar with. And so when we talk about fuzzy sets, instead of this being a set of crisp numbers, it's just a set of fuzzy numbers. Okay, and so that's all well and good, but why would it be of any value to have such a thing as a fuzzy number anyway? Just because some mathematician somewhere decided to be a neat thing to. What's that? Exactly. By analogy, that's a great definition, but let's be careful with yeah, yes, but that's exactly it. And so we could think of things that we've played with a lot in this class. So every time we've had a raster, for the most part, those rasters have been represented with one number at each cell in the vertical. Well, we had a whole lecture about uncertainty. One way to represent our sort of uncertainty in that number, whether it was elevation, temperature, precipitation, whatever the value is, you could use a fuzzy number at each cell to represent that. And so it's just a very practical, sort of useful way of representing that uncertainty. Now, fuzzy logic is a way of sort of combining, using basically fuzzy sets and fuzzy numbers. You can use fuzzy logic, and an example of fuzzy logic is an inference system, and we'll get into these, to basically do math with these fuzzy numbers. And so one simple example we could think of is, let's say I had well, we've done this example. If I have two digital elevation models, I'm uncertain about the values in each. One way I could do that is I could represent every single cell in each of those elevation models with a fuzzy number. And I do that for my two surfaces, right? And then I could use fuzzy algebra or fuzzy math to do some sort of operation. So like a difference, a subtraction problem. And so if I had two cells, um, so at this is at time 1, this is at time 2, and I had a value here, and let's say, in crisp sets that was 15, and a value here it's 14. So if I want to do the newer surface minus the older surface, what's the value? So T2 minus T1 is -1, right? Well, I could represent this instead with a fuzzy number, and I could do this simple subtraction problem. And instead of getting -1, I would probably get something where -1 is somewhere around here, but then there's some values sort of bracketing that, okay? And so we'll go through a little bit of that. There are a bunch of textbooks on fuzzy logic and fuzzy set theory, fuzzy math, and most of these sort of started popping up in the late 60s. Through 70s and 80s. So Zeta, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Zadeh, sort of like the father of fuzzy set theory. But unlike statistics, none of us ever take a class in this stuff, right? There's very few mathematics departments that actually teach a fuzzy logic sort of class or a fuzzy math class. But it's actually a pretty mature branch of mathematics, and the way it's been developed is set theory's been around for a lot longer, but fuzzy set theory is taught as a more general form of set theory. So a special case of fuzzy set theory is traditional set theory.
So what scientific literature can people find FIS in if they need to make reference to it?
There's a wealth of fuzzy
Like
uh,
in
uh,
application, I
in
guess.
application. Yeah, I mean, if you just start doing searches, and especially if you look at those searches through time, the number of citations for contributions using fuzzy logic, fuzzy inference systems has just kind of gone up exponentially over the past 15 years. So it's becoming more and more used in practice. But this website that I'm pointing you to here, which is simply the documentation for the MATLAB Fuzzy Logic Toolbox, is actually one of the most concise and helpful sort of references I've found on fuzzy inference systems. So I think that's a really good place to start. If you pick up like Zeta's book, the first chapter or two are great and really good references. Then after that, it starts getting pretty heavy into a bunch of obscure stuff that you'll never use. And so it turns out that there's first order, which is all we're going to talk about, fuzzy numbers, but then there's second order, third order, fourth order, up to nth order, as many orders as you want. And basically, if you have a number and there's uncertainty in describing that number, you can describe that uncertainty with a first order fuzzy number. But there's uncertainty in describing the uncertainty. And that uncertainty is described with a second order. And then it goes on and gets just absolutely absurd. So there's no practical utility to that.
So you surely can look a lot of environmental engineering and civil engineering literature and find applications that aren't super technical, but see what kind of questions people address with it. And it's
Absolutely.
just super duper robust literature, and it's, like I said, growing rapidly.
So, let's just go through this example. And again, I apologize that I can't, well, maybe you like it, that I can't run around and arm wave as much as I normally would. So I'll use the mouse cursor. So I'm hoping, can you guys see that? Okay. And so on the top here, this is how we would represent one continuous variable in sort of a crisp sets to define some categories. Okay, so what our continuous variable is going to be here is water depth. And the problem is, so water depth, that's great. So 0 to whatever the depth would be, that'll be in meters. And we want to assign some labels, some categories to these, and we would assign those boundaries with some, just typical set descriptors. And so dry, shallow, normal versus deep. Okay. And if I ask one person, well, what do you think is shallow? They'll say, oh, well, shallow is from 0 to half a meter. And you ask another person, they say, well, shallow is from 0 to 0.75 meters. And so who's correct, right? And this is the classic problem you have. I mean, I don't care what the continuous variable is, but if you want to try and assign a category to it, where do you make that cut? And so it's very easy to describe, these ranges. Well, from 0 to 0.75 is shallow, 0.75 to 1.25 is normal, 1.25 and up is deep. But how do I do that accurately, given that there's what we'll call categorical ambiguity? That's a type of uncertainty, okay? And so fuzzy membership functions give us a way to do that. And these fuzzy membership functions, so this is a trapezoid function that starts here, goes up, and comes down. This is another trapezoid that starts here, goes up, comes across, comes down, and this is another one. Those fuzzy membership functions, they are numbers. That's a fuzzy number, okay? So don't get those two things confused. But what I can do is I can represent this categorical ambiguity with these quite nicely. So 0 is non-membership in a class, and 1 is absolute membership. And so for my shallow class, what I have here is from a value of 0 on up to half a meter, which is where both of these folks agreed. I have absolute membership in the shallow class. So that means that I'm definitely part of the shallow class. But when I get into this gray area where, well, this one switched over to normal and this one switched over or kept staying in shallow, I can have some overlap between memberships functions. So shallow right here, this is absolute membership up to half, and then it starts going down to 0. And by 0.75, I'm outside of the shallow membership. So let's just take an arbitrary value here. So I'm coming along, I'm going to say, well, if I have a depth of 0.6, that's my input, what would be my membership in these two categories? And so I can come up, and it looks like I have a 0.25, so like a 25% membership in the normal class, and I have a 75% membership in the shallow class, okay? So this is a really simple way of taking a problem that before, you have this very binary treatment of which class that you're in, and now you can explicitly represent that categorical ambiguity. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Now, inference systems are just rule systems, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those in a second. And so an inference system is like I have an input, and then I run it through a series of rules, and I get an output. Okay, and so we've gone through this example in class before of the service, and just based off of this simple one input thing. If the service is poor, tip is cheap. If service is good, tip is average. If service is excellent, then tip is generous. So that's a lookup table, in this case with one input, and that's really simple. But the key thing here is that the inputs are described categorically, right, in an inference system. And the output is a category as well. So we're not saying if the service is 0.35, then the tip is 15%, or the tip is 20%. We're not saying that with this inference system. We're just describing it with words. Okay? So what we'll get into, and you'll see this diagram again, is the fuzzy inference systems basically take these very simple inference systems that rely on categorical inputs, give you a categorical output, and they allow you to feed into them continuous inputs and get a continuous output. And if that doesn't make sense yet, don't worry about it. We're going to come back to this. Okay, so what I want to do is we'll start with a little exercise where we build our own inference system. Not a fuzzy inference system, just a simple rule system, okay? Another name for inference systems is a rule table or a lookup table, and given inputs, we can have as many inputs as we want. What is the output? And so this is an example of a two-input rule system, okay? And so this table here on the right has a whole bunch of rules. And so if we look at the column headings here, what this first column here is the rule number. This second column is input 1. This third column is an operator. This fourth column is our input 2. And then when we get over to the sixth column, this is our output. And you could think of these inference systems as basically computing with words, okay? And all we're doing is we're just making some sentences. And so in this first row, my rule 1 is, well, if suitability of streamside vegetation is unsuitable, and that's my operator, the suitability of riparian upland vegetation is also unsuitable, then the dam density capacity is none. Well, what is this? This is an inference system that's trying to predict, in this case, the importance of vegetation for how many beaver dams you could get. So don't worry too much about what the specific example is here, but just the fact is I've got two different inputs and then I produce an output. And so how many inputs do I have here? I have two, but how many categories do I have for each input, if you can read those? Five-ish, right. So I've got, on the suitability of streamside vegetation, I've got 5 categories: unsuitable, barely suitable, moderately suitable, suitable, and preferred. And it looks like I have those same categories for that second input. Now, do I have to have the same categories for both my inputs? No. I can have as many categories as I want, or as few categories as I want. I can have as many inputs as I want, or I could have just one input. And so what you need to think about is, well, what are the things that matter for producing the output that I want? And how many categories do I need within those to sort of describe differences? And so you could have something that's really simple that just says, well, suitability of streamside vegetation, instead of having those 5 categories, it's just unsuitable or suitable. But maybe that doesn't describe sort of nuanced differences in your inputs well enough. And so I want some examples from you guys of how you might apply an inference system. You guys are all working on projects, and so the place to start for an inference system is the output, okay? So I'm just going to go around and just like, don't think too hard about this. You can do this in Excel if you want, or you can just do this on a piece of paper. But just give me an example of an output that you might try to model. Conrad, put you on the spot. A DE. So you want the dem of difference. Okay, so that's a great example because it's okay. Okay, we'll stick with that. All right. The presence of water in a stream or something. Okay, Sarah. Sure. Trail vulnerability. Okay. Um, okay. So what would the categories of the outputs potentially be? Okay. So left migration, right migration, and then in the middle might be none. So what we need to think about for the reason I'm saying okay so far, and the reason I'm hanging up here, is the output has to be a continuous variable. Has to be represented as a continuous variable, but we're going to describe it categorically. And so I'm going to say yes, that's okay, because what we could have is an output value that is lateral migration rate, and that could be negative when it goes channel left, positive when it goes channel right. And so that'll be your continuous scale, but then you can just say, you know, a lot of migration to the left, a little migration to the left, no detectable migration, a little to the right, a lot to the right. Okay? Something about bears, I'm guessing.
So their behavioral states, so wild, exurban, rural, suburban, and urban pairs.
Is that something I could represent on a continuous scale?
So there'll be two continuous inputs, housing units and
Hmm.
human densities.
But the output in this case.
Output, um, yes, it represents a continuum of land use, land cover categories
Hmm.
from wild lands to highly disturbed lands on that continuum of categories,
Okay.
and also a continuum of distribution of density and housing numbers.
Well, I was with you, but then you sort of backed up to the inputs again there. So
Okay.
on the output, if you think you can represent that output from
Yes.
0 to 1,
Yes.
sort of some hokey naturalness or development
So
sort of
just
index.
anthropogenic disturbance.
Okay, that'll work. All right.
Um, so I was thinking the current stream sinuosity
Mm-hmm.
versus the capacity for stream sinuosity in an area, and then looking at the need or the yeah the need for restoration if the stream has been channelized essentially.
Okay, so let's keep it simpler.
Okay.
Would you be okay with an output of sinuosity?
Yeah.
So just like, so it's going to be a value from 1 to whatever, right? Instead of, so that continuosity we could describe on a continuous scale. And
Yeah.
if you guys are trying to model more complicated phenomena, what we'll talk about is, inference systems aren't appropriate for every problem, but you can also model them, just model a piece of your problem. And indeed, I'll show you an example where actually we use multiple inference systems and then combine them together. And so, but in this case, for this exercise, let's just stick with sinuosity as an output. Okay, for you.
Likelihood or probability of resting or damming sinuosity.
Easy, 0 to 1. That works great. Yep.
Just sort of same thing. Probability of use,
Okay.
space.
Occupancy, your use. Yep. Something being there.
Um,
Burn, fire.
probability of inertia.
I like it. 0 to 1. We can handle that.
I'm not quite sure how it would fit with creating a mobile app.
Um, well, it doesn't. You don't have to do it for your particular project. So you could just think of anything. You could have. How about height of tree? Right. So
Diameter.
diameter. Sure. Okay.
Probability of housing development.
Okay. 0 to 1.
Something about a normalized vegetative index where you have it feed in and then adjust based on land cover, use, and vegetation type.
Okay. NDVI. That'll work.
Vegetation structure.
Vegetation structure.
And I'd note too that half the problems are 90% of them can be done with a GLM, and I mean, it, your model fits may not be as good as an empirical model all the time, so don't feel like tied to it just because it works. Also,
Yeah.
Joe's hates me right now.
No, I don't. It's totally fine. Does everyone know what a GLM is?
You guys have heard of those before you heard of FIS, I hope.
Better explain that.
We'll have a next Thursday, 10:30, this room.
On general.
GLMs, generalized linear models.
Yeah. Okay. So what I want you to do, actually, I don't want you to do the pseudocode yet. So now what I want you to do is on your piece of paper, or you could do this in an Excel spreadsheet. Um, I want you to we'll take maybe, and I'm going to pause the recording on this so that I don't have to wear this thing. I would do something like this. I've got a column I'm just going to basically put rules in, however many rules I have, right? I can um, fill that down as many as I need. And for me, I'm going to stick with the example out of the MATLAB toolbox. So my output is going to be a tip, and my inputs are going to be service and food, right? And so now the next thing that I need to think about is the categories. How many categories do I want for my inputs? And so for service, I'm going to have a category, let's say, of if service is poor or service is sort of standard or service is horrible. Those will be my categories. And then for food, I'll have it be something like, let's say, uneditable. How do I spell that? It's acceptable or delicious. Um, Gosh. So do something like that, right? And then for my tip, yeah, go ahead.
Can you have different numbers of categories for each of your, like for you could add a different number for food, and that's fine.
Made me puke. Yep.
Okay. So not delicious.
Yep. You can have as many. You can have. You need at least two categories. Otherwise, there's no point in having an inference system. Um, and you need. But you can have as many as you like. What you'll find is in this exercise, we're going to build out a rule table. And if you get too carried away on the number of categories that you have, particularly on the inputs, then it's going to explode. You're going to have a ton of outputs. And so then we want to think about, what are the categories for your output as well. So in my case, I might do um, something like the tip is stingy. How do you spell stingy? Who knows? Stingy? Is there two? What?
Stingy.
That is right? That's not stingy. Stingy. Okay. Sort of standard or generous. I don't know. Whatever you want to call these things. So just for yours, think about what you want. F4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this poor, standard, horrible. Those are my categories for service, and I'm going to copy those 4 times. And by copying them 4 times, now I can do in my food. I can go. Those are all the combinations with made me puke. Those are all the combinations with, oops, did I do that wrong? I did do that wrong. Yep, sorry. Those are all the combinations with unedible. These are all the combinations with acceptable. And then these are all the combinations with delicious. So for my example, because I had 3 categories for input 1 and 4 categories for input 2, I ended up with 12 possible combinations. So if you had a third input, then you have to multiply again by that many number of categories that you have. So what I'd like you to do now is just fill out the left-hand side, the input columns to get all the possible rules that you want to recommend. That may take you a couple minutes.
sets are explicit, right? Your rule sets are explicit, so somebody can see what your
Yeah, for
logic
sure.
was,
Yeah,
and
it's
you can go
math.
ahead. If you don't like
Yeah.
my logic, go ahead and tweak it
Right.
however you like. Change your thresholds
Yeah.
or whatever. Yeah.
And hold that thought because it becomes very,
Yes.
very important.
More importantly, though, peer reviewers never heard basically just they're looking for no reason. So
There
That's
is some of
that's
that.
at least in the LLMs.
Yep.
you think that's gonna be maybe
Go
yeah.
for the low-hanging fruit, vector inference,
Yeah.
and then see what they have. Hey,
Yeah.
Alan and I were talking about applying these meta-analysis.
What's that?
We were talking about wrapping these up into a meta-analysis on some work papers.
Okay, has everybody got all their rules out? Who has let's see, 4 rules, 9 rules, 12, 15, 20. I mean, so what's the maximum number of rules somebody has?
16.
16. Anybody beat your
48.
48? Okay, so you got,
I
how many inputs did you have?
I had three inputs.
3 inputs. How many categories on each?
Two and four categories, one point three.
Okay.
So I'm like,
So there you go. But that's all right, right? So I mean, if
yeah.
you want, I mean, it just depends on whether or not you want your inference system to kind of resolve those sort of nuanced differences, or you can lump and generalize, right? It's up to you. Now your rule tables become harder to read, but it may be really important for sort of behavior, so that's okay. So 48, that's comprised right now. Okay, who has an output that has 2 categories? Anybody with 3 categories? Anybody with 4 categories? Nobody with 4.
I did four.
You did 4. Anybody with 5 categories? No. Okay. So the next step in your rule system is this little column here. And the question to ask yourself, I guess the easy thing to do is just make all of these and. But the question to ask yourself, are there any absolutes? Um, so by an absolute, I mean I don't care what the other inputs are. Um, this is how it's, if it's one of these, it's always this. Or the or condition where, one or the other, that's going to throw it into to one output. So you can
Do you want
play with ands and ors.
do you want
Yep.
to start recording now?
Oh, thank you. Um, where do I do that? Oh boy. I think I hit F11 again.
Your light, the red bar's flashing.
Okay, so what we're gonna do for now, let's not stress in the interest of time too much about the ors, and let's just make them all ands, okay? But what you do need to think about is what happens. So this is a part where people get all uncomfortable because it seems so subjective, but there is a bit of common sense. If the service is poor and the food made me puke, then of course the tip would be, right? Or non-existent, 0, right? And so just go through and fill this out without stressing too much. What you're going to find is that for every rule, well, some of them have a clear home, but the ones where you're a little unsure, it's not like it could be anything under the sun. It's going to be one or the other, right? It's not that big of a deal. So just go through. So if I mean, and I'm going to kind of go here. Well, you know what? If it doesn't matter if it made me puke on any of these, it's always going to be stingy. And there's actually a more concise way we can represent this, but I'm not gonna go there because we can basically, if you have an input, if you leave an input blank, then just made me puke, I could represent this in one line, and so that would override everything. But I'm gonna leave it out just to have that sort of more verbose things there. So if it's poor and unedible, it's still stingy. Let's do something good. If the this oh
And do like outside.
oh gosh, that's really smart, huh? Great. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, good points. Good points. Thank you. Poor standard, horrible. Poor standard, great. Poor standard, great. That makes a little sense. So I guess we could say here that just because we felt bad, it wasn't the waiter's fault that the chef sucked. Um, right? And we would leave them a standard tip. So go through yours and fill out the output here. And don't stress over this right now. It's just get something in there. Great. Okay. So going through this process oftentimes makes people want to add another category to their output. They feel like, oh, that you know that's not really represented here. And what I would suggest to you is that adding another category to your output, don't stress about that at all. Just go for it. Adding another category to your inputs, you want to think carefully about, because adding another category to your inputs results in a whole lot more rules. Whereas even if there's only one rule that uses that new category of output that you used, it was worth having it. Um, so so that's one very hokey way, but acceptable way to make an inference system. Okay, are there questions on this? It's a glorified rule table. It's not that complicated. The key questions are, first defining my output. Second, what inputs do I want? Third, how many categories, and what are the categories for each of these inputs, and what are the categories for my outputs? And then it's assembling this rule system together. We okay? All right. So I'm going to go back to. Okay, so if you were going to implement this rule system, how would you do it? So I'd have to have some variables for my inputs. They would be categorical variables, right? And so maybe instead of calling them the words, which were like, what was it? What was my service? It was poor, standard, and great. Um, so instead of calling it poor, standard, and great, maybe I'd call it 1, 2, 3 for those, right? Inputs, but I have a variable that represents that. But I'd need to basically use a whole bunch of nested logical statements, right? So I'd have if, then, right? And so if input one is, 1, okay, then a nested statement underneath it, which would be if input 2 is 1, or if input 2 is 2, if input 2 is 3, right? So you would go through and you would basically write out all possible combinations of this. This would be how you could write code for this. The other way you would do this is manually. You just look at what my inputs are, and then I go to that rule table you just made, and you just look up what it is. So if you write out the code to do this for yourself, you're just writing something that just basically, in essence, reads through that rule table and assigns the output accordingly. Categorical inputs, categorical outputs. It's not too complicated. You could write this. In the interest of time, we won't. So pros and cons of these inference systems. The pros are these are very easy to make and apply, and they're also very transparent, right? The cons are you'll get beat up for this just being, this entirely subjective system. It's not that robust per se. Pros of an inference system are there's flexibility in how many inputs and categories you can use. The danger, though, with that is that the number of rules can just sort of grow exponentially when you tack on more. So let's just quickly go through a couple of FIS example applications. Um, I've shown you this one in class. This is similar to what Conrad described, but um, not the output here is not a digital elevation model of difference. The output in this case is going to be, given a digital elevation model, what's my uncertainty in the elevations, okay? And so here I'm going to say that there's some sort of relationship between topographic complexity and sampling, and you guys I think have seen this in class. And so if I've got a complex surface and I've got hardly any points on it, what should my elevation uncertainty be? Really complicated surface and I didn't do a good job sampling it. Right. Really simple surface and I did a great job sampling it. Low, right? And so I can use slope as a proxy for topographic complexity, point density as a proxy for sampling. And so if I have, say, complex surface, high slope, and low point density, my elevation uncertainty in this case is extreme. Whereas if I have a simple surface, so low slope, and a lot of points sampling it, my elevation uncertainty should be low, right? A very, very simple rule system. And then when you apply that spatially on a cell-by-cell basis, you can get this sort of variable output in elevation uncertainty. We talked a little bit about habitat models in one lecture, and you guys ran a habitat model for an occupancy model for cattle, basically. Here's one for fish. You could do the same thing for frog habitat or a whole bunch of different aquatic species, but where we think that the things that matter might be water depth, velocity, and the substrate type. Instead of using sort of the traditional habitat suitability curves to drive that, what I can use is those same inputs, but then I just have one of these fuzzy inference systems to drive that. And so if water depth is high, velocity is medium, and substrate is coarse or high in this case, then the suitability is high for this particular this particular rule. So, and what happens is I can get outputs, that are driven by these empirical habitat suitability curves versus outputs driven just by these sort of expert systems, and they're highlighting the same basic patterns. Okay. I've shown you the beaver example in class of trying to predict how many beaver dams that we can support on a given segment of stream. And so this is an example where I've got some sort of vegetative input, I've got some sort of like low flow input and some sort of high flow input, and those are all combined to tell me a prediction of what's the density that I might find on a network. So this could be a raster or sort of a polygon based model, right? I'm applying my inference system on every single cell in a raster or every single polygon. This one is a vector model where I'm applying my inference system to every single what? Every single line segment, exactly. And then this one with the network, that's the line segments, but then the one that you guys ran in the background, that one was on a raster, right? And so so you want to think about, how you apply these things. Now we could come up with, hundreds of examples, and indeed just going around the class, in terms of truly unique examples, we probably had about 10 here, right, that you guys came up with. So there's lots of different ways you can apply this. Now, we're going to get into the details of a fuzzy inference system versus just those really crude inference systems that we just ran, okay? And the advantages of a fuzzy inference systems is your knowledge about the linkages, about conceptually how these inputs drive a particular output. It can be imprecise. It doesn't have to be exact. And the fuzzy logic calculations, one of the really important things is that you guys just made a rule table. Some of you had as few as, 12, and some of you had as many as 48 rules, right? If I drive that model with categorical inputs, every time I drive it, how many rules apply? So the inference system that you just made, if I feed it straight up categorical inputs, how many rules can apply? It's not a trick question.
48 or 12.
No, because if I have one,
However many outputs you define.
no, so I'll just restate the question slowly. So if I drive that inference system you just made, right, with one combination of categorical inputs, okay, so I've only got, you know, one of my three inputs for input one of those categories, and one of my four inputs for our categories for input two, how many rules in that big long rule table are going to apply? One, always. So when you run a fuzzy inference system, you can have as low as one, but typically, anytime you run the model, multiple rules apply. And that's the key part of the fuzzy inference system. And the reason they apply is because of overlapping membership in different categories, given a continuous input. So it's easy to incorporate new parameters, or inputs basically. You can do this just based off of expert judgment. You don't necessarily need a lot of observations. Now, if you want to get it published, you'll want some sort of independent test of this. But these are also a very good sort of exploratory tool for just sort of basically articulating your hypotheses about how a system works, right? So even if you don't have any data to validate this, you can at least transparently put together a model that describes your sort of understanding of the system, and then you can think of ways that you can test that. The calculation is pretty understandable when you drag people through the weeds on this stuff. And these are highly flexible. One of the really key advantages of these over, say, sort of a standard habitat suitability curve driven approach, which is based off of empirical relationships between your input and the output that you're interested in, is that these models, you don't have to have any sort of assumption of independence amongst your variables. You don't have to have any sort of, and oftentimes our inputs are highly correlated, and these there's basically just not that many simplifying assumptions that you have to make to apply one of these models. So that makes them very powerful. The limitations of these is your inputs, and we didn't enforce this per se when we were just going around and making our inference systems, but your inputs really do need to be continuous variables, as does the output. And a lot of people just aren't familiar with these. And so when you say fuzzy, a lot of people just kind of like turn off immediately. They don't have any idea what you're talking about, and they just think that that's some hokey thing. Never mind that this is, these systems, at least in the mathematical literature, have been around for over 40 years, and they've been proven again and again in sort of application. So how do you build an FIS? Well, what you're going to have to do now that you have your inputs clearly defined, right? For each input, I'm going to have to define a membership function for each category. So if I have an input of let's say service, and I had three categories, I'm going to need three membership functions, right? And so so if we were dealing with sort of crisp, and you actually can represent crisp sets within a fuzzy inference system, it's just that the shape of your membership function has these vertical components to it, right? So you can represent these sort of hard-edged, just sort of boundaries between categories, if you like. And so a simple example of that might be, what did we say? We said it was service. And so let's say I came up with a score from 100% to 0, and I've got my membership of 0 to 1. So mu is just membership, and I just want to say that service is bad or good. I could have bad be like that, and This is not a different enough color. And I could have good be like that. And so I can represent this with a crisp, um, or I could have overlap. And when you have overlap, you want to make sure that that overlap is symmetric, right? And by symmetric, I mean that basically these values are shared. Because if they're off a little bit, and I come in at any given value, then membership in the two overlapping categories doesn't add up to one, basically. Okay. So are there questions on that so far? Does that sort of make sense to people? All right. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. And so there's membership functions. There's a whole bunch of different shapes that they can take. And so when you use the MATLAB Fuzzy Logic Toolbox, you'll find out that you could have triangular, trapezoidal. So here's a triangular membership function. There's a trapezoidal membership function. I could have Gaussian. I could have sigmoidal, polynomial. I could have all sorts of complicated shapes. Here's the take home. It doesn't matter. It matters between triangular and trapezoidal, but if you look at the sensitivity of the output to these different shapes, and you have these nice, smooth sort of sigmoidal functions, the outputs are barely different if you do a sensitivity test. If you don't trust me, just play games yourself and screw around with it. But the reassuring thing about that, and one of the advantages of these inference systems, is they actually tend to be very insensitive to some of these decisions that you might otherwise stress about in another style of model. And so you can just move on with life. And I generally use trapezoidal for the most part, and occasionally I'll throw a triangular membership function in. And when you're defining your membership functions for each category, so in this case I had 2 categories, you can mix the types if you really want to. It's not a good reason to. It's maybe confusing, but I could have triangular on one and trapezoidal on another, for example. Have I lost you? All right. So in terms of a set, the way that I described this fuzzy number is 3, 6, 8. And so what this is saying, I know it's a triangular membership function, and I have this transition from 0 membership to something higher at 3, so that's there. I have absolute membership at 6, and then I go back down to 0 membership at 8. The trapezoidal one, this is how I would describe it. So 1 for 0 membership transition, then 5 for absolute membership, that plateau. I go from 5 to 8 here is still absolute membership, and then I go down and at 9, right? And so you can see how I can have these different sorts of shapes. I don't have to have a symmetrical membership function itself. I can have something that's offset with a much steeper decline on one end and a much more gradual decline on the other. How do I make that decision? What you could, but what that overlap when I have membership functions is describing is what again? What kind of uncertainty? Yeah, exactly. So the categorical ambiguity, if it's low, I'm going to have pretty steep sort of transitions in that overlap. If it's high, I'm going to have very gradual, right? And so you can decide that, or indeed you can actually look at distributions of your inputs. And so James Hensley in our labs built this FIS development assistant, where if you have a distribution of your input data, you can actually just do some very simple summary statistics and looking at the shapes of those distributions to then come up with some well, I hesitate to use the term natural breaks, but to come up with some reasonable breaks for where you might want to put those boundaries and how steep or how much overlap they have. Assistant, yeah. And if you talk to James nicely, he'll give it to you right now, and if you wait a couple months, it'll be out. Yeah.
If you want to represent a crisp image, but using the FIS, how do you specify like a vertical line? How do you know what membership you want to include? The zero is
That's a
more
great question.
because it's not
Okay.
it's vertical.
I just realized that you probably can't even see this, can you? Um, can, um, so if this, and I'm tied to this spot, sorry. So if this was 0, and let's call this one 40%, and this 50%, and this 60%, okay? And what I'm going to describe first are the crisp sets that you're, actually no, first I'm going to describe the fuzzy set, okay? So this is a trapezoidal membership function for bad, and good is also a trapezoidal membership function. And this is fuzzy, and this is crisp. And what we'll do is for bad, I go 0, 0. That gets the vertical line. So that's going up like this. Then I'm going 40%, and then I go all the way down to 60%. Okay, so who can help me out on the next one here? So I'm going to start here. So my first number is, my next number is up here. And my next number, well, I go out to 100, and then 100. Okay, so those are the two fuzzy sets. And then to represent, your question was how do I represent them crisply? And so that would just be, instead of 0, 0, 40, 60, that would become 0, 0, 50, 50. And then this one would become 50, 50, 100, 100.
Well, I guess my thing is to say that like at 50% that 100% membership is 0% membership. I don't know if that
Oh,
makes
well,
sense.
so at 50%,
Because like at
it's
49.99999, you still might be at zero, but it depends on how you define 50. Like what the limit is at 50. Is it zero or is it one?
so that's a great question. So you could do 49.999 and like, you know, and then go down to 50.1 and then, and actually force a little bit just so numerically you don't have that problem. If you don't, if you define it like this, and you give it an input of 50, what it actually does is it looks at each rule independently, and so if you looked at the one, it will think that it does have absolute membership in bad. You look at another, it has absolute membership in good. So you just, in terms of how the math is, you just want to be conscious of whether or not you're likely to have an exact input, and then you can play that game.
Okay.
That's a really good question. All right, so I'm going to run through the different steps now. And for those of you that have to rush out, we'll go a little slower through this, but this is just sort of an overview of the steps. So if you're going to run an FIS, what actually happens is obviously you have to have this inference system, right? So we got an inference system. Then the first step is to fuzzify my inputs. I got to apply a fuzzy operator. I have to apply this implication method. We'll talk about this. Then I have to aggregate all the outputs, and then I defuzzify what I get. And so a simpler way of saying this is, so step one is I have to have fuzzy membership functions for all my categories on my inputs, right? Step two is basically about applying the and or the or between each rule, or within each rule, I should say. Step three, applying the implication method. This is basically how do I move across that table in my inference system and get an output, a fuzzy output. And we'll look at graphics of these. And step four is how do I then take and aggregate all my outputs. So remember I said for a regular inference system, I have one rule that applies. For a fuzzy inference system, I have multiple. So step 4 is simply about aggregating those multiple rules that applied. Okay? And then defuzzifying. So here's the irony. The way these inference systems usually get run is you get an output that is a fuzzy number. And that fuzzy number represents the whole range of uncertainty you have in defining that output. But then in practice, what people usually want is just one output. And so you defuzzify that to a crisp number so that you can move on with life, and off you go. So this is, you don't have to do that last step, but this is how in MATLAB the fuzzy logic toolbox works, how the fuzzy inference systems run. And this is typically how people apply them. Okay? So I'm going to run through those steps slowly. Are there any confusions or questions on just that broad overview? Are you guys completely lost? No? Okay. All right. So fuzzifying the inputs, this is just about going from crisp into these fuzzy memberships, and we've talked a little bit about that. Um, and so so you do this for every single input category. And so then if I am going to apply the step 2, applying a fuzzy operator, there's different methods that are supported for essentially for doing the math. And so if with and you can have a minimum or a product, and with or you're basically typically taking the maximum um, of of your two rules, right? And so what I have here is a fuzzy input right here for service, and here is one for what? This is my for the food. And so it doesn't matter that these are two different shapes. I'm coming in, and so my service is 3. And that pops in right here. My membership in the excellent class is 0. So I'm coming across. And then my food is 8. So I'm coming up, and it looks like I've got 0.7 membership in the delicious class. So if this was and as my operator, I would just get rid of this, because I have non-membership in this class, and so the rule wouldn't apply. But because the rule is an or in this case, then I can use the output that I get from this, and this result is just 0.7. And so with and, I could have I have min, and so or I can have product, but this is a little bit of a mathematical oddity. But basically, even though this is 0, we don't take the min here as 0, because this is just non-membership. It's a little bit different. So then I have an implication method where I'm taking the sort of total consequence of these two things. And I'm going to cut ahead because I want to show you, I could show you on this. This would work. Yeah. I think it's easier to see this when you have multiple rules sort of displayed. And so this right here, an input of service of 3 and food of 8. That's the same thing that we went through. But here I've got 1, 2, 3 of my rules. Okay? And so if service is poor, I'm coming up here and I have partial membership in this poor class. And food is rancid. It looks like I don't have any membership in that. But because I have partial membership in the poor, and the rule here is an or, my output is cheap. But look what happens when I take what's called the implication. So I come across here. This is the shape of my output membership function. It's just cheap. But this is my actual output. It's truncated. And so the reason it's truncated is because this value here is based off of my membership in the poor class. And so that comes across and it's truncated that output shape to something smaller. And now I go through and I do a different rule. And for this particular rule, there's no dependency on input 2. It's just what's the service. So if the service is good, then the tip is average. But my membership in that good category, in this case, looks like about 70 or 80%. And so it truncates that average, and I get this. And then here, we can go through the same thing, right? And so I've got these 3 different outputs. And so what you have to do and these are from the rules that applied. What you have to do is you aggregate all of those, and basically this is just a union of that bizarre shape, whatever it is. So this little inference system being applied in a fuzzy sense creates this as an output. And what is this telling me? My tip. And it's saying that the output is somewhere between, it looks like 3 and 25%. But there is, well, by analogy, this is like a distribution, right? But there's more mass, up over here, right? And so this is where, there's different ways to defuzzify. So I can do a centroid, I can bisector, I can take the middle of the max, largest of the max, smallest of the max, etc. But if I just take the centroid, which is very common here, then it says my tip is 16.7%. And so this is representing, based off of the rules that you set, the whole range of uncertainty in what the tip should be, which is kind of handy. But then what this is representing is the number that I'm going to use based off of this methodological choice about what defuzzification method I want to use. Breathe, digest. Does that make any sense? Okay. Are there any questions at this point? No. So when you apply this in MATLAB, um, there's a GUI that you can use to do this, or you can just run it all at the command line. And the thing to remember is that when you run it in the GUI, or when you run it at the command line, you're just applying this model once with one set of inputs, right? And so you're, in that example, this is what the food was and this is what the service was. This is what the tip is going to be. So when we want to apply these things spatially, we have to put the evaluation of these FIS models, we have to put them in a loop. And in the case of a raster, we're looping through every cell, looping through the rows, looping through the columns, going to every cell and running the model. And in the case of a vector, whether it's points, polylines, polygons, what's the thing we have with vectors? We have an attribute table. Attribute table has a row for every feature. So I just have a loop that just loops through every damn row in that. And then I have to make sure that I have inputs in some columns. So those would be attributes in my attribute table. And then I just run this eval FIS. So I'm going to show you how to run this. And then I'll show you what the file actually looks like. So how you actually build it. It's 11:55, and I think we can get through this in about 20 minutes. So I don't know if anybody has to go. But okay. All right, I'm going to start up MATLAB, which only one of you have, so you don't have to do the same thing.
Do we know if this fuzzy inference tool is visible on the MATLAB that's in the
Yes, because you had to use it for Lab 10.
probably good. That's right.
Yep. Oh dear. It's failed me. Let me try this VPN. Of course. I just loaded this up and it just worked. I'll show you what it does here. I do have some video tutorials that show how to use the MATLAB stuff. And so what I will do is I will put up these slides with this video, and then I'll provide a link to where the videos of how to use the MATLAB stuff are. This is not ideal because you're not going to be able to see these very well. But how many of you have used MATLAB other than in that class? Okay. So in MATLAB, you've got a command prompt where you can just type in commands, but then they also sort of confuse you by having a few things that you can access via these sloppy little GUIs that they make. And so if you go to the Start menu in MATLAB and you go up to toolboxes, if you have Fuzzy Logic Toolbox loaded, there's a little thing for it that says Fuzzy Logic Toolbox, and then it will let you open up an inference system or create an inference system, and it brings up, let's see, it brings up this screen right here. And so what this screen, and I apologize that I can't show this to you in full resolution, but what this screen is basically your inference system. So these are two inputs in this case. This is the inference system itself, and these are the outputs. And what you can see is it has the name of the inference system, what type it is. It has the AND method. Remember we said, is it min or is it product? It has the OR method, et cetera, et cetera. And if you double click in that GUI on one of your inputs, it brings up this membership function editor. And that's where you can, with the graphical interface, you can draw or you can specify your input membership functions. And it even has this little pull down for type. And so you can switch it between triangle or trapezoid or polynomial, whatever you wanted to use. And so what you end up having to do to build your inference system is you first tell it how many inputs there are, and that'll show up as multiple inputs along here. And then you tell it, what the outputs are. Then you go into these editors and you add as many inputs categories as you want. And then you can add labels to those categories. So for tip, it's the tip is stingy, or the tip is average, or the tip is generous, etc. And so you can go through and you specify those in there. And then you have a rule editor, which is this little dialog that is basically doing what we did in that little Excel table, right? And because you've given names to these things, it just has a little, if input 1 is this, if input 2 is that, then output is this, and it just lets you build out the rules, okay? And so that's all quite nice. And then it has two other features. One is this surface, which only works if you have two inputs, but it's a way of visualizing what the output will look like. I don't find this that useful, but this thing is really useful. And what this is the rule viewer. And what the rule viewer does is it has these red lines on here, which represent where your input is on that continuous scale. And you can physically just pull those red lines, and it just moves the input across, and or you can type the inputs in down below. And then you can see how you create, which rules apply. So in this example, I've got partial membership, it looks like right here. So I'm getting a little bit of this rule, and then a lot of that rule, and then none of this rule. And so then you can see what sort of output you get there. And so I'll show you a couple examples of those. I'll come back to this. So this is that simple tool rule input tool rule system I had for estimating elevation uncertainty. And so this is basically what the rule viewer spits out for you. So if I have an input here of slope of 2%, it looks like I've got a low, a medium, and a high category. Well, I've got absolute membership with that input in the low category, right? So I have the potential for these three rules up here to apply based off of that first input. If I look at point density, I have absolute membership in what looks like the high class, right? And so 1, 2, 3, those three rules apply. So the only rule that actually matters in this particular input example, because I have absolute membership in these two categories, is rule 3. And this is the shape I get for rule 3. And so the total consequence of that is pretty boring. It is just the low elevation uncertainty output. That's my output there. And then when I defuzzify that shape, I get an output in this case of 1.3 centimeters. Great. A different example, same inference system, different inputs, right? So now this time I'm going to have a slope of 20%. Well, that puts me at absolute membership in the high slope category. So only these three rules might apply. Point density of 0.2. Well, I've got partial membership. You can see it's split between low and medium point density. And so so these ones don't apply because I don't have low, medium, slopes. I have high slopes. But now I've got two rules with partial membership here where these apply, and so I can see what the implication is of the membership in those categories when I come across, right? And so the output for this rule, which is high slope, low point density, is a high elevation uncertainty, but because of the membership in this point density class, this gets truncated right there. Versus there's a little higher membership in this one, so this is high slope, medium point density, and then that's the output I get. And then the total consequence of all of those is shown here, and when I defuzzify that oddball shape, I get this. And so that is one of the nicest things about the fuzzy logic toolbox is it has this rule viewer, and so you can understand the behavior of your inference system by just playing with it in this.
You set the defuzzify to a centroid or whatever
Mm-hmm.
to get that increasing set.
Exactly, for this one. Now, one of the things you have to be careful of in defining your output membership functions is the range on your highest category of the output. So what I mean by that is here I'm describing elevation uncertainty, and if I end up in a case where I have my elevation uncertainty is getting into that if you think about it to the far right, it's getting into that highest category. Um, the range of elevation uncertainty is going to strongly control how these shapes turn out and what the defuzzification is. Right, so here it looks like I'm truncating that range at 0.75. If I truncated it arbitrarily at 1 meter instead, I'd get a completely different number. It would skew that value. So when you're dealing with the overlapping membership functions to the left, you don't have to worry about this as much, but for that last one, that extreme case, you always need to just be conscious of what the range that you're using there is, because that can have a big impact on your number. I see some confused looks. You could transform, I mean, what we typically do is calibrate on this. So we have some independent measure of our output, and we look at the distributions of that independent measure of the output, and we see when we're getting into those extreme cases sort of on the tail of your distribution, and try to calibrate the bounds appropriately. All right. I'm going to go back a couple steps here, and I'm going to talk about this thing. So MATLAB gives you a GUI to, so that you can visualize this stuff, but you don't need it. Everything is actually represented in this very simple flat text file. And this text file is just an ASCII text file, and it has a .fis extension. And when you open this up, you can open this in any text editor. There's this header portion here, and what it does is it has the name, and that name is the same exact thing as the name of the file. It has the type of fuzzy inference system you're using. You can play with this, but Mondani is by far the most common. The version of the fuzzy logic toolbox that you're using. Number of inputs, okay? So 2, 3, 4, whatever. Number of outputs. You can actually have inference systems with more than one output, but let's not go there. And then number of rules, and then you have your AND method, your OR method, your implication method, and then your defuzzification method. So this little header, 95% of the time you just use the defaults that MATLAB comes with. And the way I usually build these is I don't bother using MATLAB's little GUI. I usually just open up a text editor, start with another FIS that I know, and I go and I edit these three things: number of inputs, number of outputs, and total rules. Okay, and then the next part of these fuzzy inference systems is basically your membership functions for your inputs and your outputs. And so if we look at this, so I'm scrolling down in that text file. Here's input 1. Here's input 2. There's output 1. That gives you a name for the input, the range of values that it can take on a continuous scale. how many membership functions, so 1, 2, 3, 3, that better add up. And then what type of member, or oh, this is the name for each category, low, medium, high. This is the shape of the membership function, trapezoid. And then this is just this stuff, right? So trapezoid, it's going to have basically a set with 4 numbers in it. A triangle is going to have a set with 3 numbers in it. And so you can go through and edit these manually. The only thing that the MATLAB GUI does is it prevents you from doing stupid things like saying that you have 4 membership functions when you only have 3. But if you're careful, you can just build these out, and it's very easy once you get used to reading these text files what's in there. Similar thing for the output, and then the next piece of it is our inference system. This is the rule table. So if you built that in Excel, you can sort of copy that over your text, and then you can just sort of find and replace all your lows with 1s and all your mediums with 2s and all your highs with 3s. And then you can translate it into something that looks like this. So the way you read this is, okay, this first column is input 1. The second column is input 2. After the comma is my output. And then I always get these backed up or mixed up, but basically you can apply a weight to each rule. And I can't remember which order this goes in. And so if you want to make one rule more important than another, you can assign it a higher weight. But usually you just leave these defaults as 1, and so then you just build out your rule table, and that's the last part of that text file. And so if you guys want to run these, what I would suggest you do is you go to Lab 10 and you download that .fis file that you had to work with before, and you use that as a template, and you can just edit it in a text editor, going through the concepts we went through today, which is for the inference system, right? Building out this table. And then for the membership functions, you just have to think about, how much overlap you want in those. I think in the beginning it makes more sense to do all of those steps manually and really understand how these work. And then I would use the rule viewer to really get a feel for the behavior of your inference system. You can start playing with it. If you want to run that spatially, the MATLAB code is provided in Lab 10 to allow you to do that. And if you need help with that individually, it can help you with that. Yeah. You could run them. Sure. Of course. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we could find a time next week. And
See if we can meet up there on Tuesday instead of being here.
yeah, we could do that because all Tuesday was going to be was just sort of a generic help session. So if folks want help with this, then we can help you with that. For free. Um, what I'll show you, I wanted to show you in MATLAB, but if you install the student edition, which you can get for free, MATLAB gets installed in your program files. You go into MATLAB. Oh, you can't. Oh shoot, it's on extend. And let's see here. Sorry. So if you go into your program files and you go into MATLAB, inside here there's a toolbox folder. If you go into toolbox, these are all the toolboxes that are installed. You go into fuzzy, this is all the code for this. So if you just copy off of the lab computers, the fuzzy folder, into it, this is illegal. It's $300, and I'm not condoning this. I'm just pointing out that this is something that others have done in the past. What will happen is that you can run, because every time you run something in a command prompt in MATLAB, you can run any of the functions. And the main function here is eval FIS, and you pass it the FIS that you're using, and you pass it the inputs. And so it will work. What won't work is you won't have in your start menu, when you go to toolboxes, you won't have fuzzy logic and then you just bring up that GUI. But if you go to the help documentation, I can't remember what the command is, but the GUI just has a command and you can just type it and it'll just open up the GUI. So it's very, very simple. And then let's see here. If I can skip ahead. I think you get the idea. We've talked. So this right here is the function. This is the meat. This is what runs everything. It's eval FIS. So if you just type eval FIS and then you pass it the right parameters, it will spit out an output, which is the defuzzified output. And so if I look in here, what I'm doing in this command right here is I'm passing it two inputs. So this is my input 1, this is my input 2, and then I'm passing it my FIS. And so that's all you do to run this. In this case, I am being a little bit cleverer, and I'm assigning my output to this variable called beaver veg capacity in this one, and I'm putting it actually in an array. So I'm doing this for every single row in my um, my file there. So this is how I do it for vector. This is how I do it for raster. But the actual command is just this eval FIS. And so if I forget the B and this stuff, if I just said eval FIS and I gave it a value that was reasonable, so say like I did eval FIS 30 space 50 comma this inference system, and I gave it the path to that, it would spit out the output just right there. But this is how you actually run it in a loop, and that is what is that's what's provided in the MATLAB code in Lab 10 that no one opened up, no one looked at, no one paid any attention to. You just ran it at the command prompt following the little video instructions I gave you. But what it's doing is dead simple. So did we confuse the hell out of you? Does that make some sense? Yeah.
Can I ask so that little tree plot that you said is useless? Like it seemed useful at first, but what is it plotting on the z-axis, like the
The
x-coordinate
output.
to, but your output membership to which
Your
system?
defuzzified output.
Oh, it is the defuzzified.
Yep. It's your defuzzified output. And so what happens is you see these little sort of like terraces and plateaus in that. And those are all just artifacts of defuzzification, right? Um, and so, depending on what you're trying to do, that may be totally fine, or you may want something that's a little bit more continuous sort of looking. And so you might tweak things so you don't get, such big, I mean, it just depends on what you're trying to model. Um, so it's okay for a two input rule system, but even so, it takes a while to wrap your head around what it's displaying. And I think it's easier for people to just run the little rule viewer thing so that you're getting getting that kind of output, or B, start applying these things spatially and start looking at the spatial patterns. So like here's a 3-input one, and that's point density, this is slope, and this is GPS quality, and then there's the output. And so you can, when you start looking at the spatial patterns, then you can start seeing whether or not the outputs are reasonable and make sense. And the ideal thing to properly validate these is that you have some independent estimate or some competing model or some empirical data that you can compare to that spatial output that you're producing to see if it's well, it depends on the model. So like in this case where it's elevation uncertainty, we actually would go and we would use a mix of like bootstrapping tests where we'd hold back some of the data, build our models without that data, use that data to independently test, or we'd go and resurvey the same area like 10 times in a row without changing. We knew it didn't change at all. We use the exact same methods and then just look at variance in the output, as a proxy. But it completely depends on what phenomena you're trying to model. So, all right, go be fuzzy or whatever. So.